This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
All right, welcome back to Transparency. We're excited to talk with Sasha Ayad today. Most of our viewers, I think, know you, Sasha. I think a lot of the people that tune into our podcast probably watch yours as well. Gender a Wider Lens, as well as just familiar with your YouTube channel. So we're excited to have you on and talk to you. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. We definitely have a lot of overlapping listener base, so I'm really glad to be here as well.
So we would love for our viewers just to get to know you a little bit, on a personal level, professional level. If you could just talk a little bit about your professional history and who you are.
Sure. So I was kind of thinking about how far back exactly to start. Let me just start further back to give some more context. So I went to undergrad originally thinking I wanted to study medicine. Actually, I had always been really interested in taking care of people and the kind of nurturing, caregiving aspect of it. And my family, Egyptian family, being the parent of a doctor is this really awesome, prestigious thing. So that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I got to undergrad and realized that chemistry was the bane of my existence, and I really hated it. And I was interested in science, but I don't think my mind really worked that way. And I was also just having way too much fun in undergrad. So I ended up putting my pre-med pathway to the side. And I started taking psychology and sociology classes and found them absolutely fascinating. Initially, I was just really intrigued by some of the unusual kind of abnormal psychology types of things that you might study, like unusual conditions or mental health issues or even traumatic brain injuries. I was really interested in all of that. And I was also interested in kind of collective ideas. So how does a culture influence the way we think? I was studying a lot of social psychology and that kind of thing. So I remember when I decided to get my master's in counseling psychology, we didn't really have much training around that time, around gender identity, that kind of thing. So
when would that have been about?
I started grad school, I think in 2003 or 4.
Okay.
So at that time, I had heard, of course, of the concept of what was transsexual at the time and then gender identity disorder. And I just remember thinking, wow, what an absolutely unusual but difficult experience. If someone is born into the world convinced that they are the wrong biological sex, that would be very difficult. And I was, at the time, just completely sympathetic to anything that we could do to help alleviate the suffering of that person. And I also took the perspective that, you got to take people at face value, at their word. And if someone is saying that this is their experience, let's just kind of go with it and see if we can alleviate their suffering. Though I never worked with anybody with gender dysphoria, so it wasn't something I had spent much time thinking about. It was just a passing, chapter in a book or something in grad school. Also, though, my own personal journey with my sexual orientation and developing my own sense of self kind of took a lot of weird twists and turns, I think, as many females experience with their sexual orientation. So I also knew personally that there's not a straight line in terms of delineating who you are and what category you fit into. So without going into detail, I just had personal experiences through people I dated and, romantic attractions that I had that were varied, right? Unusual pathways, I suppose. So, fast forward a little bit, I was working in a counseling center for women and children who were victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence. And that placement had a strong feminist theory behind it. And so I was also starting to think about things like male violence and women in those kinds of abusive situations. So there were all of these factors that kind of confluence of factors that led me to where I am today, which is really interesting. I was also later on working with autistic children. So I was doing like in-home therapy with children on the autism spectrum. And then I guess most recently, prior to my private practice, I was working in a middle school. And so this was around 2013 when I got that job. So what I started to notice is that there were these news stories that I saw about trans kids, which was a concept that was pretty new. So even when I had been in graduate school, we had heard about gender identity disorder, and that the concept of a transsexual or transgender person was more of an adult. It wasn't talked about in childhood in the same way. And so around 2013 and 14, I started seeing these news reports of trans kids. And the first thing that came up for me from like the feminist background that I had was, gosh, a lot of this is stereotypes. So I started thinking a little bit more deeply into the question compared to what I had thought about in graduate school. I thought a lot of this is stereotypes. And I also knew that a lot of the experiences that are being pointed at to indicate someone is a trans kid are also very common in the lesbian community. I knew that. And I knew that a lot of gay men experience some kind of gender incongruence as children. So I started to notice this and I thought, this is kind of interesting. And then I started just kind of going down a rabbit hole on the internet, looking at parent reports that were starting to pop up of people not only reporting that their children were, quote, coming out as trans in a very similar way, but also the part that really shocked me was that doctors and therapists were affirming almost immediately. And that was what really, to me, raised some red flags. And then congruently, I was running our school's first GSA, Gay Straight Alliance. And so I started this GSA club for middle schoolers and high schoolers. I worked in a charter school at the time. And in those meetings, I was really aware that the kids were coming in with all kinds of language that wasn't something I had been exposed to as a graduate student. It was new. They were talking about, gender identity bracelets where you wear a different color every day to indicate what gender you are that day. And there were all of these new ideas and new concepts these kids were talking about. And frankly, they were confused, but they also seemed really wrapped up in it. So I can pause there because there's a little bit more to the story, but that's when I really started to think something culturally is going on, which is really different from what I read about in textbooks in graduate school. And I knew that there was more of a social aspect to it.
And then I remember from you saying that, like, were you like supposed to be in like, or you were the school had implemented some sort of like transgender awareness training or something that was again all just in the affirmative, and you're like, you were already like, no, this doesn't seem right. So you kind of like, you never you kind of clued into this from like day one of what was going on culturally, and so you never had that kind of, oh no, what are we doing, that a lot of other people did. But what was that like? So can you talk about that curriculum and what your reaction was to it?
Sure. And I think there's a little piece of background that I want to add before I tell that story. There was a kid that I was working with in the middle school. I was there for like about 3 years or so, 2.5 or 3 years. And there was a kid I had been working with in the middle school who was female. She was very just socially awkward. She didn't really have a lot of friends. She used to kind of have problems with some of her teachers, and she would be like inconsolably angry. And I was like one of the people on campus that she actually trusted and talked to. And about a year into our work, she started saying, I don't think I'm a girl, Miss Ayad. And we would talk about it and I would inquire more. And she was saying, oh, well, on Tumblr, I saw this or that thing, and I think I'd like a binder. And so I was really careful about it because I knew that if I was too pushy, she could retreat. But if I was too affirming, I could inadvertently lead her down a path that may not be best for her. So I worked really carefully with this kid. And long story short, in the course of a year or so, she ended up making some friends at school, and the gender thing just kind of disappeared. And the way she explained it to me at the end of the school year was, I was lonely. And when I started to make friends at school, I realized, I don't need to go down this gender path and be trans just to make friends online. I started making real life friends. So while that was happening, the school was a district of like 13 campuses. And so we would have periodic trainings where the school counselors from each campus would come together and be trained on various things. And this was a charter school system in Houston that served really like low income families and a lot of marginalized kind of families with all kinds of different challenges. So I thought it was really interesting when they said, oh, we're going to be doing a training on supporting transgender students. Because I remember asking around at the time, out of 13 campuses, we only had 4 students identifying as trans in the whole school system. So I was like, given that there's so much other stuff going on in this population, we're talking about like generational trauma and serious poverty and like really chaotic lives. It's funny that we're doing a trans student training, and it was put on by some local advocacy group. And by the time we had that training, I mean, I knew my shit. Like I had stacks and stacks of like research and data. And I had been totally going down a rabbit hole of disbelief about what was happening. So by the time we got to this training, I saw the training as being completely ideological, not based in evidence, not even really with a clear definition of what gender dysphoria is. It was more about identity and supporting identity than it was about gender dysphoria and how to best, because the training was called How to Support Transgender Students. It wasn't how to support kids with gender dysphoria. So I was really annoying during the presentation and asked a lot of questions and was kind of, probably drove the presenter nuts, but she handled it really gracefully. But I went to the supervisor of all the counselors in the school at the time. I had been having meetings with her regularly, trying to show her the information that I was learning about the possible social contagion of gender dysphoria. And I remember her saying to me something like, Sasha, honestly, the pace of change with all of these LGBTQ things is so fast that I can't even keep up. And so I think it's best if we just leave it to the experts. And I said, aha, that is what is happening. So in order to actually bring some sanity to this conversation, I think more of the clinicians who are catching this and seeing it have to become experts, or else these advocacy groups, which are ideologically driven, are going to position themselves as the authorities, and all the other clinicians who recognize what's going on will just be seen as like weird conspiracy theorists in a way, right? So at the time, one of the people I had discovered in my research was Lisa Marciano. She had done an interview, I think it was in 2016, with Feminist Current, where she was the first person I heard talk about the potential social influence going on with these kids. And so I reached out to her, connected with her, and started realizing that there are no therapists actually offering services for gender dysphoric kids. Lisa wasn't seeing them. She was writing about it. And I know she's worked with detransitioners, and since she has worked with some dysphoric youth, but there were no therapists you could find that actually explicitly said, I work with gender dysphoric teens in a nuanced fashion. So for a while, I was the only person that I knew of explicitly advertising my services that way. And it was kind of weird and shocking. And I don't think I realized, how complicated the whole field is politically. I was just like, well, this is true. So obviously you just do what's true and everything will fall into place. And I was maybe a little naive because I had attacks against my license and things got real controversial real fast. But for a while, I think I was the only person explicitly saying, like, I do this kind of exploration-based therapy. And I was inundated, as you might imagine, with contacts from parents, like frantic parents. And the kinds of stories I've heard now, I started my practice in 2016, it's now 2022. I've consulted with over 500 families, and the kinds of things I've heard in these consultations is absolutely shocking. And it makes me pretty certain that this is a medical scandal. I know you guys have talked a lot about that and about what is going to be the fallout of this. So I agree very much with that perspective. And so I think we're coming around. I'm kind of just going on a long-winded tangent here, but I think we're starting to turn the corner, because now that we have clinicians from the affirmative camp being like, oh, maybe it's a bad idea to start medically transitioning small children before they go through puberty. Like, now that the affirmative clinicians are speaking up, I think the media is starting to steer the ship very slowly. But people like Lisa Marciano and myself and Stella O'Malley and so many other therapists have been sounding this alarm for quite some time. And I'm glad that the media is starting to notice, not fully aware, but starting to notice.
I can understand how from outside the LGBT community, it must feel like, I can understand why there's so many sort of conspiracy theories that have spun off of this, because it must seem like we're all in on it, but I'm not really well connected to the LGBT community anymore, but I mean, I certainly wasn't in on this. I've watched this weird thing take over, wondering where did this come from and how did this happen? And there's certainly, Aaron feels the same way. And like a lot of us in the LGBT community have no idea where this came from or how this happened or why things seem so weird and who's making these decisions on our behalf. It's seemed a bit of a mystery to me. And then when I started hearing psychologists talk about psychic epidemics, it seemed to be a feasible explanation for what's happening, that this thing just sort of bubbled up that seems to not have a single source. But what is your understanding of what a psychic epidemic is?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different angles we could go. I mean, Carl Jung talked a lot about mass hysterias, and psychic epidemics are periods in time where a culture on a whole is exhibiting more mental illness than it is exhibiting sanity. So in this particular realm, we could look at the fact that a delusion kind of sweeps through a population, and the delusion is not connected to any observable objective reality. And I would say in this case, it makes sense, because again, we've moved away from talking about gender dysphoria, which is a condition, which even that is a bit tricky. I know, Aaron T., you were telling me about this book that you're reading. So we'll talk about that, how all psychiatric and psychological conditions, for the most part, are culturally constructed rather than something like finding a cancer cell in your lung. You can do the biopsy, you can examine it, you can determine what it is, what is the component or cellular structure of those, whatever. All mental health diagnoses, to a degree, are shaped by our cultural understanding of what it means to be mentally ill. And so when it comes to this current kind of thing that we're going through regarding gender identity, it's like individuals and institutions have all been captured by this not objectively verifiable idea of someone's gender identity. And it is taken over. And then in a kind of psychic epidemic, you'll find that individuals who are trying to speak about the objective reality or truth are kind of deemed heretics or, the bad people. So we've seen epidemics happen like this in so many realms. Of course, we know about the witch hunts, and something I thought was really interesting was the multiple personality disorder and satanic panic rituals. So they're kind of connected, but not necessarily. And so this happens in cultures or in moments of time where there's a lot of psychic stress or destabilization, and people who are vulnerable to these kinds of epidemics are individuals who, it could be all of us, but also individuals who are vulnerable in some particular ways. Like, for example, with the teenage girls being highly vulnerable to social contagions, teenage girls do experience a lot of very distressing and destabilizing aspects of their identity and their sense of self and their emotions. And so all of these factors can make somebody more vulnerable or susceptible to taking on this kind of mass hysteria or mass psychological illness.
Mm-hmm.
And it
and
happens
girls are more
on a big
empathetic
scale.
than boys,
Yeah.
and so it kind of, that's how it kind of spreads in girls, is
Yeah.
because they're connecting so deeply with one another, whereas boys not as much.
Yeah, the way girls share in their relational sense, the way they share with one another is by, talking about their most psychological and intimate parts of themselves, and then empathizing with one another and trying to relate to one another and hearing one another's distress. And that's incredibly powerful in a positive way, and it has tricky, implications too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some interesting parallels between the satanic panic or the dissociative identity disorder explosion that happened, because the role of the media, because I believe that started when the book Sybil was written, and then the movie was created about it. So it put it in this very rare psychiatric condition into public consciousness. So the media was more interested in it. Therapists, it was on therapists' minds. And so when clients coming in, the therapist had a role in creating false memories, because they were kind of primed to be looking for this.
Yeah, well, we can talk a little bit about that. So I think one person that your audience should be aware of is Debbie Nathan. She's a journalist who covered both phenomena. So she covered the multiple personality disorder epidemic, and she also covered the satanic panic ritual abuse epidemic. And all of the kind of false accusations and individuals who were jailed for years behind these really crazy accusations and were later exonerated. But so, Debbie Nathan documented in a book called Sybil Exposed. There was a psychiatrist, I can't remember her name now, but she had been kind of nursing this theory about multiple personalities. And she had a patient who came in and reported something kind of odd, like there's a little girl inside of me or something. And so working with this patient, they ended up kind of co-constructing this really rich narrative, and also, of course, personal experience in the patient, that she had these multiple parts of herself. And I think the psychiatrist got someone to co-write a book with her. She got an author, like a writer, to co-write a book with her. And this book was very, very popular. And within, I think, a 10-year span of time, just thousands and thousands of cases of multiple personality disorder were being reported in the literature. And when you think about it, I think what's important for people to remember is that all these cases of psychic epidemics are indicating something metaphorically true. And I think the same is true for gender dysphoria. Okay, so if you say, metaphorically, there are different parts of me inside, that's metaphorically true. If I am, just waking up, getting out of bed, and like having my coffee, I am a different person than when I'm deep in a therapy session with someone reporting a trauma to me. And so I'm experiencing myself in different ways. Or if I'm incredibly angry at my sister, this rage part of me, like that's like maybe this angry man that just wants to lash out. So metaphorically, these things are true. There's nuggets of truth in all of them. Mm-hmm. But then they become literally true. And the mind constructs kind of a narrative using that metaphor to understand all of the suffering. And then we're very malleable. And so we can kind of inflate those particular feelings or experiences. And so that man may become this guy named John who lives inside of me, and like, John's here now, and you're talking to John, and John's pissed. And then in other moments, it's like, well, Ophelia just woke up and she's having her coffee and she's just feeling blissful. Like, it can become much more specific, okay? And so this book comes out, Sybil, and all of these young women start reporting that they have multiple personalities. And I think what's really important to remember in addition is that the role of the professionals, the medical professionals, is really important. And you probably are reading this in the book, Erin T., called this book, Crazy Like Us. In any culture, we have individuals who are seen as the authority figure on all things healing and wellness, right? So whether that's a shaman in a different type of culture that kind of mixes up potions and gives it to people, or in our culture, you know, like psychologists or psychiatrists who can describe to you what condition you have and how to treat it. So these are the authority figures in our cultures, which help us make sense of the distressing symptoms we have. And so when multiple personality disorder became reported in all of these patients, what was also happening in parallel is that clinicians developed like this whole theory and framework around multiple personalities and how to help extract multiple personalities. And similarly, you know, like repressed memories. So there was this belief that personalities come out as an expression of splitting inside the person from memories they had to repress. So there was this theory that sexual abuse was incredibly rampant, and that actually most people who have been abused don't know they've been abused. And so it's the therapist's job to help them reconnect with those memories. And so you had a field of psychology training therapists on how to do this. And they were using all kinds of interesting techniques. Like, I know that there were therapists who used, can't remember the name now of the drug, but like kind of sedatives. They would give their patients sedatives to put them in this like trance-like state to help them, quote, recover the memories. So it's like the power of suggestion, the power of belief in the authority figure as having the answers to help you. And there are tons of reports of that time of people saying, you know, like, I came to a psychologist with depression and I left with multiple personalities and I left with like a repressed memory. And it's almost, you know, very similar to what's happening now. Of course, it's different that we have social media. So kids are self-diagnosing before they get to the therapist. But, you know, of course, we have therapists now all being trained in this affirmative model, which is like, we all have this magic gender identity inside of us. And our job is to just help the kid experiment and try on different genders. And so it's really similar. And it's remarkable to me. And I hate to, I'm not trying to kind of characterologically attack this person, but it's shocking to me that Diane Ehrensaft, who is a developmental psychologist and one of the primary kind of proponents of gender identity theory, she was also a primary proponent of like the repressed memory sexual abuse stuff. So that's shocking. I mean, I have papers that she wrote about that. So it's like there's this belief in this magical unseen inner thing. And you can put that anywhere. It could be gender identity, it could be repressed memories, it could be multiple personalities, it could be who knows what's next, but this will come up some other way when all of this is over, I guess. When
you were saying, you know, these therapists were intentionally putting people in a kind of trance-like state where they were more suggestible, I never really, though it seems obvious to me now, but it never really occurred to me that social media sort of plays that role of a trance-like state in which we're just absorbing information like TikTok. I mean, these kids look like they're in a trance when they're on their phones and they're looking at TikTok videos.
I mean, we know that spending a lot of time on screens creates like moments of dissociative experiences. I mean, even dissociation is kind of a controversial term because we're talking about now dissociative identity disorder, which is on the rise again, by the way. There's a whole TikTok community of DID kids.
Everybody talking about their systems.
Yes.
And now the two converge. I'm sure everybody's seen that really viral video of the young woman or maybe teenage girl talking about how she has multiple people in her system. All of them are trans men. She is not. And now she has to transition to appease all the trans men in her system.
Yeah.
So horrifying.
Yeah, but I mean, to the idea of dissociation, it's not that you are completely a different person, but it's pretty obvious to any of us who's ever used technology that, you know, you spend too much time like staring into a screen and you kind of forget that, oh, my leg went numb 10 minutes ago. I didn't even notice. Or, you know, it is somewhat of a dissociative experience to be kind of glued into this blue light screen, and you're no longer connected to the 3D physical world around you. So there is a hypnotic element to watching videos for hours and hours and hours and kind of going further and further down that rabbit hole.
Frightening stuff. I did sort of it wasn't an intentional experiment. It ended up in hindsight being an experiment because I was on a Facebook group of it was about 2,000 older trans men. So I think it was like age 30 and up. A lot of them had on there talked about, and I've been on that forum for years. I wasn't participating in it much, but it was a group that I was on Facebook and kind of forgot about it. But their posts would come up every so often, and very low drama group, just a bunch of older trans guys. And a lot of them, because they're older, had lived part of their lives as lesbians before they transitioned. So I thought here might be an interesting place for me to just test an idea. And I just, knowing that a lot of them had lived as lesbians in their past, I posed the question to them of, do they ever feel as though they're in conflict between trans rights and women's rights when they hear stories about, you know, men being transferred into female prisons and things like that? Do they ever feel an inner conflict about that, having been lesbians at one time? And I knew some guys that were on that forum personally, but the immediate reaction was, you're a bigot, you're a TERF, and I was booted off of the forum with no conversation. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because I knew some of these guys from 10, 15 years ago, and back then we were still in the lesbian community, and trans men, and I've talked about this before in the podcast, that trans men and butch lesbians were still in similar social circles at that time. There was some tension building between the two as butches were grieving the loss of a lot of us, but it was still very clear to me, like we weren't all of a sudden completely different species just because some of us started taking testosterone, and then I left the community. So it was just interesting to me that something has taken over the consciousness of these guys, like where they're not able to think critically anymore, and they're not able to acknowledge their past as women. And it was just shocking to me that this way of thinking has set in, like a mass psychosis has set into this whole community of people.
You know, I'd be so curious, Aaron, if you were sitting down with any of these guys one-on-one, like over coffee or something, and just having a conversation face-to-face, I wonder if you would have gotten that same reaction. Because another concept that I keep thinking about is, it's funny because, you know, I talk about this concept all the time, and then I literally forget it the second before it's supposed to come out of my mouth. Pluralistic ignorance, there it is. Pluralistic ignorance is the idea that we all hold the perspective that what is being said out loud is the most common belief. So if what is said out loud is, you're a bigot, you're a TERF, that's transphobic, we assume everybody really thinks that. But pluralistic ignorance is documented, and it shows that a lot of times, most of us actually don't think that, but we're all scared to say because we think everyone else thinks so. So, you know, there are lots of examples where a touted belief, the most visible belief, is actually not what's true in most people's minds. So especially with the age group that you mentioned there, Aaron, these individuals are old enough to remember the kinds of discrimination that they faced as lesbians and the kind of challenges that women face. So I would suspect that on one hand, some of them probably are kind of caught up in this mass delusion, but I wonder too, with social media and the kind of performance and posturing that we all do online, I wonder if that's an element that also needs to be considered when we talk about this here.
That's a good
Yeah,
point.
I think most of what we do online, and I had to kind of think about this a lot a couple of years ago when I was getting just having a really antagonistic conversation with an old coworker of mine who I considered a good acquaintance, like friend, somewhere in there. And he was basically calling me a transphobe and getting all these likes and then I was getting all those, the sarcastic laughing reaction, so all this is going on. And I'm like, it had occurred to me, like, he's performing for his fans. Like he's saying this for the likes. Like, this isn't a conversation we would have interpersonally. This is a conversation. He knows what his audience wants to hear. And I am just the wall that's happening against. And so I think like so much of what happens on social media is done with the clear understanding that I'm performing for an audience and I need to say what they want to hear, or what's going to get a positive reaction, what's going to clear my name so that I'm not associated with the bad person. So yeah, it's very different what people do for an audience, which is all social media basically happens for an audience, and what we have interpersonally.
Yeah. Something else I'm kind of thinking about is that like mass psychosis happens when enough fear is drummed up in a culture or in a society. And I'm thinking about, most parents that I talk to have found me because they're solidly on the side of like, this doesn't sound like my kid. I need to understand what else is going on. But then every now and then I speak to a family that maybe has adopted the affirmative model. And sometimes they're on their way to realizing that the affirmative model didn't really help their kid. Like maybe they saw an escalation in behaviors or whatever. Sometimes I talk to families that are still really gung-ho about the affirmative model. And what I've noticed is that it's really coming from a place of fear. If a parent who's known their kid for 15 years, their kid suddenly comes out with this announcement that seems shocking, it's only because of really extreme fear that a parent would go along with it. And when you think about that as like buying into a delusion, it makes a lot of sense, because under no regular circumstances where you think everything is safe and fine, would you go along with it? It's only because you're really afraid of something terrible happening that you're going to put aside everything that you knew for 15 years and go with something that feels super counterintuitive and unusual. And I mean, when you look at in history, mass psychoses that have happened, we know that the culture is always terrified of some horrible disaster. And that's why they go with a delusion instead of objective reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes me think of, obviously there's so many parallels that can be drawn from obviously like recent history, what we were just talking about with psychic epidemics, but like the most famous one from history, like the Salem witch trials, at a time of great social unease, when there's basically like native raiding parties tearing up villages all around them. And anyway, there's this kind of sense of the outside world. There's something very scary is happening beyond our control. And we kind of like just sort of, fixate and ruminate on these. I don't understand why that happens, but apparently it just seems to keep happening throughout history. But this one is just so interesting in that, again, like in recent history, the medical establishment has encouraged it and facilitated it, and that's obviously happening again here. But Aaron, going back to what you were saying, is like, this isn't a conspiracy. Like I wasn't aware of any like what was going on or what was driving this. Is I see like these just a handful of cultural influences that are very overwhelming, which is this kind of fear of this really weird zeitgeist shift that we've had with social media and just like globalization and where we are like as in culturally is very interesting right now. And I think so that kind of unease that seems to precipitate these in the past, and then as well as see, I object to the saying LGBT, because part of the big problem is conflating this with homosexuality, because then there's like this it's like a moral righteousness to fight for trans rights, because we know what happened with with homophobia, and we won't want to make that mistake again. So I think so much of this has been pushed forward by the gay conflation. And then when you add social media, obviously that's going to make a psychic epidemic or a social contagion exponentially worse than they were ever able to be before. Like Sasha, you said, these psychological problems, or how we're diagnosing different mental illnesses, they're completely socially constructed. And in the past, they were also socially confined, right? Because we weren't able to just talk about it, to anybody that wasn't basically in our near, vicinity. And now with social media, it's like they're no longer socially confined. And so just again, in that book, Crazy Like Us, where the notion of anorexia, the Western notion of anorexia, is imposed on Hong Kong. And suddenly all these girls are developing this Western notion of anorexia that didn't exist there previously.
Yeah.
And that's, that was in the 90s, right? So the beginning of kind of like this, again, the globalization of the American mind, as the book's titled. But so now it's like with every kid from the age of 10 at the latest is basically on social media and is absorbing these ideas that are just in broadcasting their own, and everybody's just hyper engaged the world over. There's just, and then when we're in a post-religious age as well, we're in a secular, basically everything, but we're still driven to find religions and communities that kind of, where we have a shared moral code and a moral purpose, and this provides that. And so there's just so many things that make this just take such a strong, it just has gripped us so strongly for, I think, a variety of reasons. And that's why it's going to be really, really difficult to untangle it all.
Maybe why it's taken me by surprise is that the private conversations I have with my trans buddies hasn't changed. So when we're all sitting around the kitchen table, we're still talking about, when I used to be a dyke at the folk festivals, and we're pretty open about our whole history. But when we're at work or out in public or around strangers, we're just dudes, because there is a fear of that. Well, it isn't really appropriate to be that intimate with strangers, but there is fear that if we're out as trans guys, because most of my friends live what we call stealth, where they're not out to everybody and they don't announce that they're trans everywhere they go, and they just blend into society as, appearing as men. So there is a fear of, if people knew this about me, knew my history, knew that I was trans, that it would change their perception of me, and in some cases maybe I wouldn't be safe, which is a realistic fear in some cases. But I think that fear is also can be exaggerated and overblown as well.
Do you think that fear, well, maybe not necessarily the fear of being harmed or treated a certain way, but do you think that fear of people knowing your kind of whole history is exacerbated by the kind of gender ideology concept, which is that you are a man, you've always been a man, and to say anything otherwise is transphobic? Like, that seems to be really distinct to a certain kind of activist mindset and a certain kind of current rhetoric, which is different from transsexualism, which is, I'm very aware of my biological sex. I was born this way. I transitioned to be this other way, but all of that was part of my life. Like the young people that I talk to now seem to be really just trying to pretend like that entire history didn't happen. And that's validated by the idea that, well, if you're trans, you were always the sex that you claim to be. What do you think of that?
I haven't had many, more intimate conversations with the younger ones about how they think of all of that. In my practice, when I was seeing some trans identified youth, we were talking about that a little bit, and most of them seemed pretty realistic about it, that they were hungry for an explanation, and they'd obviously been doing, like, the ones that I would say had like the classic gender dysphoria seemed more realistic about it, and they had done research and found, like the brain scan studies and stuff, and so they were trying to make sense of their gender dysphoria and trying to feel some sense of validation that it's a real thing. So I think they were all open to very reality-based conversations. But yeah, there were the ones that were very invested in the trans culture, who weren't as open to having conversations about biology and, a very reality-based way of understanding it. Because I don't think a lot of those kids had classic gender dysphoria.
Yeah. Aaron, you were talking about the way eating disorders spread in Hong Kong and the kind of globalization, and there's a rapidity through which these ideas can spread now that is so different from all the social contagions we have seen in the past. Because the truth is, we've seen this happen time and time again in so many different cultures, but this is so diffuse because of the way kids use social media. And it's pretty interesting hearing from parents in other countries where, in the Far East or in South America, where the cultural context around issues of, race and gender and all of that is so different. And yet their kids are watching American TikTok teenagers talking about activism and how to be anti-racist and all this stuff. And so it's really interesting to see that we're not only exporting our concepts of mental illness, but we're also exporting our concepts of what like social justice looks like, which never take into consideration the way these issues of race, class, gender, sex show up in other countries in totally different contexts. So I mean, it just came to my mind, and I find it to be really fascinating and I guess a little bit sad that we're homogenizing the way a whole generation of young people think that is culturally and contextually inappropriate for where they are in the world. And I just find that weird.
Why do you think it would take hold then? Like if you're absorbing content that just seems completely foreign to what's going on, in your country, in your culture, why does it take hold? Like, why not just be like,
I think I actually can speak to that. So like my parents are from Egypt, but they both left Egypt when they were pretty young. My dad was around 20 and my mom was in her teens. So to be fair, I mean, I'm totally westernized, but I have friends in Egypt that I keep in touch with on social media and also through like conversation. And I know that in a lot of the world, especially the developing world, America is seen as the gold standard for everything. We're the most advanced. We have the most money. We have the most medical technology. And so also, if you think about entertainment, like American films are the gold standard everywhere as being the coolest and edgiest. And so you see, even prior to social media, like this isn't even related to TikTok, celebrity culture from the US is fantasized about by people in every part of the world. And so whatever is popular and cool here is just seen as like the next progressive good thing. Now, of course, in Egypt, there are a lot of people that critique the West and critique America for some of the things we do and say, but the young generations who are trying to differentiate themselves from their parents, they look to the West to be, setting the tone for like how you talk. I mean, there's even a word in Arabic, which means like uncool. And it's when you say certain things that are like the traditional Egyptian kind of language versus like more chic words that they use. So they'll blend like Arabic and English words. And that's like what the cool young generation does. So I just think it's hard to estimate why, like how important America is seen in so many different realms. And I think especially when it comes to our medical understanding, like if you have a sick person in any developing nation, I promise you their fantasy is to come to America for treatment. Mm-hmm. So whatever we are saying in terms of like, what is social justice? What is healthcare? What is all this stuff? I think that is probably seen as what to strive for.
Okay. We're just culturally collapsing on ourselves, but other people are still like, oh, this is good. This is good.
Yeah.
In the coming weeks, we're going to have a trans man on from Africa who's a psychologist in Africa, but also a trans man. So I'm really looking forward to just asking him how all of this is playing out in a very different, on a different continent.
For sure.
Because the UN last year, the UN released a report last year about gender identity. The gender identity framework, I think, is what they called it. And we're saying that we want to implement this framework around the world because it's proven to be of benefit to the LGBT community worldwide. And it's like, I don't know if we want to really spread one of our worst ideas ever around the globe.
I know. Do you know what country he's from, your guest?
I actually don't know which country. I think it's Western Africa.
Okay, interesting. Well, this kind of also brings up a conversation we had recently with Paul Vasey. It's either Vasey or Vasey. I forgot how to pronounce his last name, but he is the researcher who studied the Fa'afafine. And for some, I don't know if you guys are seeing this, but in the last 3 months, I've seen people talking about the Fa'afafine constantly, and I had never heard of the Fa'afafine before. Is this a Twitter thing, or I don't know?
Think I've never heard of it until recent conversations, because Helen Joyce talks about them a good amount in trans, and I think maybe that was the inundation in our little cultural sphere was but she's talking about Paul Vasey's research,
right?
As I understand,
yeah. So, I mean, it was really interesting to talk to him because, I mean, what it boils down to is that the way we understand innate phenomena is culturally dependent. So it's not that there's no such thing as people who behave and act like or feel more comfortable in the opposite sex roles. That's innate. But I think the way we label, categorize, and understand those individuals is what's culturally, dependent. And I guess this whole thing really is interesting because while somebody like Paul studies the Fa'afafine, who are usually identified pretty young as being sex role atypical males, this whole ROGD thing also brings up the question of what is innate and what's not? And can you develop symptoms that start to look as though they were innate, even though they were late onset? The whole thing is really interesting. And we've been doing this Pioneer series on our podcast where we talk to people whose knowledge is kind of foundational. And some of them have been therapists and some have been sexologists and sex researchers. And it seems like overall the sex researchers believe that what they're studying is innate. And then therapists and psychologists from our world seem to think that a lot of this is socially mediated. So I'm really curious of where that overlap is, because I'm not sure. I really don't know if it's easy. It's not easy to draw a distinction. And I really believe that we can adopt all kinds of symptomatology culturally that is maybe not innate. So I don't know if I have a question or I'm just throwing out ideas, but you guys really focus on gender dysphoria as a condition. What do you guys think? I mean, what's the GD Alliance position? Is gender dysphoria an innate condition?
Well, my answer to that would be, it depends on how you're defining gender dysphoria. I mean, my whole interest in this area is basically kind of tearing apart the notion of gender dysphoria and looking at the nitty gritty that we're kind of dumping in there. And so, but I think what looks like innate gender, or because a lot of what people call gender dysphoria is a body identity disorder, dysmorphia related to their sex characteristics, right? And then that can obviously be caused by childhood sexual abuse or just a harassment that over time that internalizes to a certain degree. Then there's the paraphilia kind one, which obviously there's controversy about whether that's innate or not. Then there's obviously the like Paul Vasey was talking about, and this is unfortunately controversial as well. I don't understand why. Is that, well, maybe people who are homosexual, it's because their brains are more masculinely aligned or feminine, and so like that's why gay men often seem much more feminine, like in a way that women are, and lesbians much more masculine in a way like men are. And so I think that can easily be understood as like the innate gender dysphoria, but a lot of those people outgrow their feelings of unease with their sex, and it never becomes like a body association, whereas the more sex dysmorphia is, and I think the sex dysmorphia is one that develops That's culturally inundated upon you. It doesn't make it any less real than whatever could be innate. And then the paraphilia one, that's another story entirely. And some of these overlap as well, actually, because if you have like with autogynephilia, if you've got this fixation on having a female body, and then when your male body contradicts that, it can result in revulsion to your male sex, and that's still a dysmorphia. So yeah, there's no way to answer like what is gender dysphoria. Is it innate? Is it culturally constructed? Because it's we're defining so many different things as gender dysphoria.
One of the things, because I had an experience of what I now call gender dysphoria from such an early age, it's easy to think that it's innate, because I can remember it as far back as like around age 2 or 3. But I think one of the ideas that I've been exploring for myself is I sense that there's a dimension of homosexuality that isn't well understood. We understand it as who you are attracted to, but I think there's also a dimension of being gay or lesbian, of an instinct to mirror the opposite sex. And we see this in other animal species. When an animal is gay, whether it's a lion or a cat or a dog or whatever, when an animal is gay, it tends to behave socially like the opposite sex. And so I think that is perhaps an innate part of same-sex attraction that a lot of us experience as children, and our culture tries to stamp that out. I've heard so many gay men say that, I really liked wearing my mom's dresses and high heel shoes, but there was a certain age where I was told that's not okay. That's not how boys behave. And I actually think it's a natural part of a gay or lesbian sexual orientation that gets culturally stamped out of us. And I think for some of us, I think it exists on a continuum and like a spectrum. So I don't think it's as an intense an instinct in all gay or lesbian people. So perhaps easier for them to just shut that off and maybe find an outlet for it as a drag queen or something. But I think some of us, we have trouble shutting it off because we're on that, just the far end of that spectrum of that aspect of our sexual orientation. And so for me, it does feel like I've reclaimed a part of myself, because I do think that aspect of my sexual orientation, not because I'm claiming an actual manliness. I don't believe I actually changed sex, but I think it feels authentic to me because it's a claiming of my sexual orientation that our culture had no tolerance for.
Oh my God, that's such a good point. I remember thinking many times when I started learning about all this gender stuff, like, wow, we have moved on as though we have somehow learned everything we need to know about homosexuality. Like, we are so arrogant to think that, oh, we got that gay thing down, because I think the narrative is like, as long as people can say the words "I'm gay" and then have others go "great," then we've conquered it. But actually, there's so much we haven't integrated that fact at all. And I think part of what's interesting is like the whole queer theory thing, which I know Aaron K, you talk about this a lot, of changing boundaries and definitions. Like, for us to say, being gay has nothing to do with like how feminine or masculine you are. True. Okay. Absolutely. Like, of course, there are going to be people who have same-sex attractions that are very gender typical. But the fact is, there's this something that we all, I think, instinctively know about gay people acting and mirroring the opposite sex that we haven't properly integrated into our culture in a way that there is acceptance and room for that. And we've moved on so quickly to labeling that as trans. And I'm just thinking about, like some of the years that I spent more immersed in the lesbian community. It was so obviously known that there was this way that some of the, masculine lesbians mirrored men's behavior and were referred to as guys. And it was innate, and it was also kind of playful, and it was understood, again, somewhat metaphorically. It wasn't literally that they were guys. And I knew a lot of women who wore like sports bras or binders, but they were still lesbians and they had this masculine aesthetic, and they hung out with, whenever there would be like an interaction and some cis regular guys were around, they would either be kind of like mocked or critiqued by them, or they would be like one of the guys. Like, this was so known in certain communities, but I don't think it was really integrated into the wider conception of what it means to be gay. I think like the mainstream is like, oh, cool, you're dating another woman, or you're married to a woman. It's about like gay rights and about being able to say, I'm coming out. And it's about saying, we have a lesbian that works for us. But where is the real understanding that these are natural variations? I mean, that's where I agree with the gender theorists. These are natural variations in human identity and expression, but they've literalized it and chopped it up into a bunch of different labels, rather than understanding these are kind of subtle things that you probably won't get unless you're really immersed in the lives of individuals who have these experiences.
Which in the early days of queer theory, I think that's what it was aiming to do, was just creating some cultural space for the gender nonconformity of gay and lesbian people. But it became way too literal.
Yeah.
Sasha, you had a great quote from many, I think it was one of the early episodes of Gender Wider Lens. I was listening to you, where it basically said what we're doing is we're concretizing, I can't even say that word, concretizing, you know what I'm saying? Concreting abstracts and abstracting concretes. And it's just a very dangerous thing to do. But we're seeming to just gleefully be doing that right now.
I will, I don't remember saying that. That's pretty good. I do have to say, I think I borrowed the word concretizing from Lisa Marciano, who talks about this a lot, because she talks about taking something that is a metaphor and turning it into something concrete and literal. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really an attempt to make sense of something. And I think the way we make sense of something in a contemporary world is by labeling it and defining it and turning it into something in our kind of lexicon of identities, like these identity lists. It's really an unfortunate direction for things to go when identity is actually so much more complicated and interesting. It's unfortunate that we're just kind of distilling it down to these, it's almost boring, like these memeified Instagram things you can throw up, I would like to encourage people to listen to an episode that we did with Stephen Levine, where he talked about identity in this incredibly rich way as a kaleidoscope, that there are these different parts of us. And then as we grow and interact with different people and have different life experiences, you kind of turn the kaleidoscope and the parts shift and change. And it's really beautiful and it's very poetic. And I do think we've kind of collapsed onto ourselves in a way that prevents us from seeing that much more rich way of looking at ourselves. And I wonder too, recently we talked to Dr. Az Hakim in the UK. It's not out yet, but he was talking about the overlap with autism. And it's really gotten me thinking, I don't think I've thought about this enough, but the way a person with autism is really into categorization and labels and concrete thinking and that black and white thinking feels deeply intertwined with the way things have gone. And I wonder too if that's a function of technology itself. Like, how deep can you really get when you're sharing memes and hashtags, And I feel like the direction things have gone would not have been possible without the role of social media and technology, because these platforms just shape and mold the types of thoughts we can even have on the platforms. Whereas like you talked about, Aaron K., queer theory came out in the 90s, and that was prior to, the widespread use of, the internet in that particular way. So I just wonder, like, is this a manifestation of something that is directly tied to technology use, like super directly? And does that mean that we have to shift our technology use to get out of it? Is it just going to keep morphing into like other weird like online campaigns, you know, like you can almost see it with like the detransition campaigns too. Like, I don't want everything to just become another like social media driven narrow silo where everyone's just in their little boxes. I just went all over the place, but I'm really curious about the role of technology in all this and where it's going.
I am as well. I've been wondering for a while. It's like I feel like social media has done a lot of. I mean, originally I think it was doing, it was good. Everybody thought this is great. But it seems like the end result has been quite disastrous. And I'm wondering, how do we get ourselves out of it? It seems like the only option is just be like, nope, that was a bad idea. It didn't work out well. Let's shut it down. That's obviously not going to happen. We just can't do that. But also, can we really solve the problem social media has created with social media? I don't think so either. So I honestly am at a loss as to where this goes, but I'm quite fascinated by the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's seems to be like a point of where all these things converge, right? Because a lot of people with autism are into tech, a lot of trans people are into tech. So we see that point of convergence where a bunch of people with autism who like, as you say, those categories in order, they're the ones actually creating a lot of these social media platforms that are on social media a lot, and then spreading some of these queer theory based trans ideas.
Yeah.
I'm speaking of Asa Hakim, I obviously haven't listened to that episode yet. I'm looking forward to it, but I was hearing I think maybe it was a tweet from his I was reading when he was asked about detransitioners and regret rate. And he basically said, I've noticed the more autistic, the less they regret. And so it was almost most baked into his answers that these people are typically quite autistic. And it's just how autistic is the question, and how that experience shapes out. Yes. And I was telling Aaron, I think once we finally get to the bottom of this, like, I don't know what that means, like solve the gender thing. I don't know what that means, but like, I feel like once it's all decontextualized, obviously I'm quite optimistic when I'm talking about this, like there's an endpoint is how I see it, which is probably not the case, but I keep thinking it's like when we reflect on this period of history, I think the autism thing is going to be overwhelming. It's going to be overwhelmingly obvious in retrospect, but it's like, in it.
Unless we just keep producing people with more and more autistic traits, and nobody will ever be able to put it all together. I don't know. I mean, that's probably insulting on like 40 different levels. But I mean, if as Hakim is right, that the more autistic traits you have, the less kind of cognitive dissonance you have about this, then I mean, if we were being really cynical, we could say, well, maybe this is just a new language-based reality, and as long as the pronouns are right, it's all good. I don't know. I think that the medical truths will have to be what catches up to people, and I wonder, like for people like yourselves who are, of course, very, very aware of all of these complications, if you experience like negative impacts from your medical transitions, do you think that lands differently on you than on somebody who, for example, is in like a total fantasy that I'm going to become literally the same thing as a biological male? And like I've heard people talk about, well, now I'm just kind of changing all my risk factor levels to the same exact risk factors as a biological male, rather than, well, I have a female biology, and when you do these things to a female body, there are some other really complicated things. Like, I'm just wondering, because I think sometimes about like, what is the bursting bubble that creates some people's desire to come off of hormones and either stay identified as trans or detransition? And I think sometimes it's the people who lived in a real unrealistic fantasy, and then the bubble bursts and they have this realization of, oh my God, I was totally misinformed about what this means. And I wonder about people like yourselves who have a much more like sober and grounded in reality perspective of transition. Like, do you think that's a protective factor on your mental health? Does that make sense?
I think so, certainly. I know for me, like I think, and Aaron as well, you've had this experience where there are periods where we totally believed it. Like I for a long time, I believed my brain was male, but I think I talked myself down from it. I keep calling it like a deprogramming that I did to myself just based on reading detransition stories and hearing all the different experiences and realizing, oh, this isn't one thing. I've done this for what, my own personal reasons, and those aren't the same as other people. So I kind of talked myself down from it. I still, socially and physically, I feel so much more comfortable now than I did pre-transition. And so it's easy for me to just be like, this was a decision I made based on weird ideological, it helped, but like, I think as I progressed in the transition and the more I got into the trans, like the more I believed the literalness of it, that my brain is male. And so it was kind of like a roller, like a mountain, like of okay, I'm just altering my body, and then back to, okay, I just altered my body and, it worked. And so I think because of the fact that I didn't have any disastrous, fingers crossed, any disastrous happened to my body, like my top surgery was a success, the hormones, haven't had any problems really. And then it was just intellectually, I talked myself out of it. And so now, if I do at a later date realize hormones are doing me much more harm than good, then, I can cross that bridge, if and when it comes. But yes, I will have a much more sober understanding of what I've done and how to deal with it moving forward. But it's interesting what you said is about the people who had this really concrete understanding of their transition, and then some disaster basically took that. Like I was talking about this recently on the episode we did with Laura, who's a detransitioner. She transitioned and detransitioned eons ago. But she was saying that it's weird to see the fact that now we've got all these these queer genders, all these varieties of genders and pronouns, and people are taking like micro doses of testosterone and getting, nippleless mastectomies, and, like people are going in these really abstract directions with it. And when I first, kind of encountered the idea of trans trending, now I believe we're all trenders. That's just kind of, it is a trend. But like when I first encountered that idea, I assumed, oh my God, these people are going to be detransitioning in droves. Not me, not the true trans like myself. But then when I did actually start talking to the detransitioners, by and large, they're the people who have that same thinking of me. It's like, I'm really a male. I have to fix my body to be male. And so I think, and I was wondering, like, why is it? Why are the detransitioners the true trans, as it were? But I think what you're saying, that's exactly why, is because when something terrible happens in your transition, you have to come face to face with the reality of, oh, I'm not male, or I'm not female, and go from there.
Yeah, I think that bubble bursts for lots of us because it's, and Aaron and I have talked about this quite a bit, that it's hard to know. Like I had experience of gender dysphoria. I saw this as treatment for gender dysphoria, but I still didn't really know what narrative makes the most sense to make sense of that whole experience, because we're not being taught about what is gender dysphoria and what is the reality of that. I think it's common to cycle through different narratives trying to land on something that makes sense to our experience in a way that integrates our whole experience and helps us mediate into the world. And none of those narratives really work unless you just sort of kind of start to delude yourself. And I wasn't willing to live with that. As a mental health clinician, I value mental health and I want good mental health. And so that's when I just kind of gave up on a lot of those narratives, because at some point we have to land in reality and in a way that we can just live an authentic life and feel integrated in some way. But I think, in the case of Aaron and I, we had enough mental health and resilience that when that bubble bursts, we were able to kind of pick ourselves back up and we're okay. But I worry about, like, maybe with someone with severe autism, they're able to just kind of stay in that delusion and filter out any contradictory information. But I think there's a point where the whole bubble is going to break, right? Where this becomes more, it becomes just Main Street culturally known that this whole scandal has happened. And so I do worry about the fallout of that for a lot of people, not just trans people, but also their families who supported them, their clinicians who supported them. I think the fallout from this is going to be huge, which isn't to say that we shouldn't proceed, to correct this wrong. But I do hope as we go, we're creating an infrastructure to support people through, I think, what's going to be an identity crisis for a lot of people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we sometimes, my fiance will say, like, how long do you think you'll be doing this gender stuff? And I said, it is going to keep shifting and morphing into different really severe needs forever. Like, I don't think in my lifetime, the individuals and the families impacted by this will stop needing some kind of evolving set of care. It's really complicated, and it's really our best guess at this point what is going to happen down the line.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like hyperbolic or make any too many World War II equations that people are so, or equivalencies that people are easy. It's easy to do, but I feel like it's going to be the same kind of, when we discovered. Again, this is going to sound so intense, but like when we discovered the concentration camps and what was happening, that had been happening for years, that people kind of like, oh yeah, there's a lot of discrimination happening and they're being oppressed over there, and Hitler's gone too far, but not really understanding the gravity of what was being done to thousands and then millions of people. And again, so that's why it sounds so hyperbolic to make an equation. But I think that kind of that mental, like, oh my God, what's been happening? That same kind of cultural, this has all been happening right underneath our noses. And we either cheered it on, not really understanding what we were cheering on, or we just kind of like, oh, I'm sure they know what they're doing. We'll just let that go. And I'm not an expert. I don't have any, any expertise on this issue. And I think, yeah, so like you're saying, Aaron, that identity and that completely cultural identity crisis is going to happen, and people are going to, it's going to be devastating for people far beyond just those immediately impacted.
Sometimes I think if if an alien came down to the planet that had no contextual understanding of anything, and you told them the entire Western world is sacrificing the sexualities and future bodies of children based on an idea of being born in the wrong body, they would be really confused. And you really have to step back and look at what is happening and push aside all the narratives and just say, what are we actually doing to children's reproductive organs? When you think about it like that, it's shocking, and it really is a testament to the importance for people to understand how these kinds of social forces work, so we can be really hyper vigilant about what things do we choose to believe in, what cultural narratives do we adopt as true, and where do we draw the line about where does physical objective reality need to be defended.
That's why I keep starting a few years ago, I started to look at this. I'm a bit of a history buff. And so I put like a historical lens on it. Like I just put myself, a generation or even like a decade or two in the future and look back at this. Like you're saying, the alien analogy, like that's what I started doing, is just like, what are history students going to think, 20, 30, 50 years from now, going like, how did this happen? And then so I've started looking at the current cultural forces that have enabled this, but it's still baffling to think that people can go, yes, in some instances, some babies are born with the wrong brain, and you have to fix their body so that it matches their brain. Like it's just absolutely batshit. But like we've just all gone, yeah, that makes sense. So that's the part that's still like, and this is like Western medicine. We're supposed to be so like, it's just,
so objective,
without evidence,
fact-based. Yeah.
It's like if there was evidence for it, like if there was evidence that they scanned all of our brains and there was, something about our brain that was different, then fine. But I think that's where I think that's the part that kind of woke me up. It's like, but what is the evidence? So that, this culture is trying to say that I actually am male. It's like, well, but what is the evidence of that? Like, and there is none. But I think the magnitude of what's happened is a barrier to people waking up. Like, it's so huge that it sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Like that all of our governments are in on it, the entire LGBT community's in on it, like at the UN level, they're all in on it. And so it sounds like a wacky conspiracy theory because it's so huge and it's so widely accepted as the truth. And it's all around us, like, and life seems to be going on as normal for most people. So I think it's going to be really, it's a barrier to getting people to accept that and to hear our side of things and see that this is true, because it's going to cause such dissonance in people and a cultural crisis that's going to be a barrier to breaking through to the mainstream.
Yeah, just the realization of how far it's gone. And I guess, again, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, remember, one of the factors that makes a society vulnerable to a mass psychic epidemic is fear. And I think the fear of suicide is what is being used as the number one driver. Like the parents that I was referring to earlier, the ones who are willing to go along with it, they're doing it only because they're really afraid their kid's going to kill themselves. And this is a really serious topic. It's an important topic. I mean, I don't know if we have time to go into it here, but I think it's just important to understand the way that misused statistic and misuse, really, there's a lack of evidence that this is a serious direct correlation. The Tavistock has said, luckily, that suicidality is actually, or suicidal behavior is very rare. Luckily, there are very few completed suicides in gender dysphoric kids, but that fear is what creates the urge for people to just kind of be lulled into this false belief system. And I think until we properly address that fear, and luckily we know that there are a lot of mental health problems, but not necessarily any more than with other mental health conditions. And until we really address the misuse of that fear, I think people will be willing to kind of keep getting pulled along.
One thing that doesn't tend to get highlighted with the Tavistock thing, when that ruling happened, I guess that was about a year ago, when it was ruled that kids wouldn't be able to go on puberty blockers without appealing. So all of that was halted for about a year until that was reversed. And to my knowledge, there weren't any completed suicides in that year. So when they weren't allowed to proceed with the medicalizations. So, and that isn't a point that seems to be highlighted.
Yeah.
Laura Edwards-Leeper, on her interview with Megan Daum on The Unspeakable a few months back, she straight out said that the suicide statistic is completely false. Like there's no correlation here. So I hope, Laura and others will, kind of like keep sounding that alarm that this is a false scare tactic, and it's like the cruelest form of manipulation.
Yeah, there was an interview done in the documentary film, the Swedish film, The Trans Train, and they were talking with a world-renowned suicide expert. I can't remember her name now, but she was asked about this 41% stat, which comes from the largest survey, the transgender survey done in 2015. And I think the question was, well, first of all, they didn't assess whether the individuals who are filling out the survey are pre or post transition. They're just individuals who identify as trans. And they were asked if they've ever attempted suicide. And I think 41% said yes. And they asked this suicide expert, she's like a world-renowned researcher who studies this, and they said, do you believe this? Do you think this is possible, that 41% of the people in this study actually attempted suicide? And she said, no way, it's impossible. That is an astronomical number. And they kind of talked about the biases that can happen with anonymous online surveys asking about this kind of question. It's very, very tricky. And I think the reason suicide is so complicated to talk about is that if there's any chance that 41% were telling the truth, that's a huge number. And we would want to do everything we can to prevent suicide ever if it's possible. And so I think people with suicide, I think the perspective is let's always err on the side of caution. Let's always take the most conservative approach. And I don't mean politically, I mean kind of like risk factor wise. So when you have, again, that kind of fear, people are willing to push the limits of their rationale into a place that, of course, makes us do things that end up being more harmful than helpful.
And I think along similar lines, but in another direction, is again with the parents, those who have chosen to go down the affirmative route, probably on bane of the suicide threat. I think the parents who've conceded to this ideology and the transition of their children, they're the ones who are going to fight so hard to maintain the perspective that transition is right and good and the best decision. Because like, how do you grapple with that decision? And I've said this before, it seems like, and then on the other side, like this is really hinging on the parents. It seems like that's where the most of the emotion and the motivation comes from, because on one side, you've got the parents who did affirm, who did allow their children to go in that direction, and they're going to cling to, no, this was the right decision, this was necessary. And then the other side of that is all the fourth wave now parents and the Gen Spect parents who are fighting tooth and nail to destroy this and to stop it, to save their children from it. And so it's like, those are the two, it's the parents where most of this I think cultural force is going to be. That, and obviously those who are financially committed to the gender industry.
Yeah, to be honest, I think the parents who go down the affirmative road, that's not a homogenous group either, right? So there are parents. I think I've noticed this interesting trend of like parents of really feminine boys that are young, like the little ones who transition, like 3 and 4. Sometimes they become like celebrity moms, right? And they make a whole career out of being a trans girl's mom. Then there's there's so many different parent groups that fall under this category, but I have met a significant number of parents who, when you look at their stories, they are also victims of a kind of toxic influence from the gender clinics. The gender clinics use a lot of tactics to scare parents into submission, to make them feel rejected for asking certain reasonable questions, really using threat of suicide and fear. So these parents are also victims in a way too. And I think when we, like you said, Aaron T., when historians look back at this, the role of authority figures and professionals and the kind of coercion used there is really going to be important to examine. But I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thanks so much for agreeing to come and chat with us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having me.
Dark content, but yeah, important stuff.
I know it's tough, but I'm glad we're all here.
Yep, yeah, me too.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.